Hey guys, welcome to week 5. I wanted to go over a few things here in the announcements that occurred last week on your quiz, just to clarify a couple things. There were 2 questions in particular on the quiz that had Hebrew typos in them, so I just gave everybody full credit whether you got the answers right or not. These were the word ahrev. This is how it appeared on the quiz. I think that's supposed to be ahrav with the kamets here. And then we had shane, but that's supposed to be sane. And so with those 2, if you did get those wrong, let me know. But I gave, as far as I know, I gave everybody credit for those 2 questions. Just because if there's a Hebrew typo, whether you should know it or not, I'm not going to penalize you for it. So wanted to bring that up. And then also wanted to give you just a little bit of a tip on distinguishing between 2 Hebrew verbs that are very similar. All right, so we'll just look here at the lexicon in the back of your book, your vocabulary list, I should say. And these 2 words are avah, and then the other word is ahav. Okay, so let me just highlight these so that we can keep an eye on them here. Ahav and avah. And here's the way that I remember these 2, because I always got these confused. Avah has the v sound before the hey. Ahav has the v sound at the end of the word. Okay? And so love, the V sound in love is at the end of the word. In avah, the V sound is earlier. I think of like voluntary or I want something. Just whatever you can do to get the difference between these the bait hay and the hay bait here, whatever you can do to keep those separate in your mind. I think probably the more helpful one is the ahav ending with the V sound of the bait. Love ends with the B sound. Whereas, if you were to say vaunt or voluntary, that V sound comes earlier in the word. Avah would be he wanted or he was willing, and ahav is he loved. All right, so hopefully that's helpful. But I noticed that some people did get confused on the quiz between those 2 forms. All right, so as far as this week goes, we're going to lesson 21. And we're going to start learning about participles. What is a participle? Just like an infinitive is a verbal noun. We talked about that last week. Infinitives being verbal nouns, they have the qualities both of verbs, that is that they have patterns like qal, nifal, pl. They also have qualities of nouns, so they can take suffixes, they can take prepositions, stuff like that, so they kind of live in both worlds. Participles also, they're not verbal nouns, they're verbal adjectives. So when you look at a participle, you got to understand that you've got verbal qualities, and you've also got adjectival qualities in the participle. So what that means is that the participle is based on a 3-letter verbal root, just like other verbs are. It's going to have a triconsonantal root, and it follows certain verbal patterns like the qal, the pl, the hifil, that sort of a thing. But in addition to those verbal qualities, a participle also has qualities like an adjective, and this means that a participle can describe another noun or describe a noun just like an attributive adjective can. An attributive participle can describe a noun, so that would be something like the phrase the singing women. In that phrase, women is the noun, and singing, that is an adjective describing the noun, but it contains a verbal idea. The idea of singing isn't like the adjective angry. It isn't like the adjective large. It isn't like the adjective beautiful. Singing is an action, and so it's got this verbal quality to it. So that's really all that participles are. They are verbal adjectives. They're adjectives that have a verbal quality to them. All right, and so the participle can describe a noun. That's what we call the attributive function of a participle. It's identical to the attributive function of an adjective. A participle can also assert something about a noun. That's what we call the predicative function. It's just like the predicative function of adjectives. So if the attributive function would be something like the singing women, the predicative function would be something like the women are singing. It can also function as a noun itself. The participle can itself act like a noun, and that's just like the substantival adjective. So we've got substantival adjectives, we've also got substantival participles, and those are participles that are basically just acting like nouns. So if an attributive translation of a participle would be the singing women, and a predicative translation would be something like the women are singing, then a substantival translation of a participle that's functioning like a noun, would be something like the singing ones or the singers. that would be a noun. In particular, we're going to be talking about the Qal Active Participle this week. That's a particular type of participle. We'll learn about a bunch of other participles as we go. But the Qal Active Participle is called active because the Qal Active Participle is describing actions that its noun is performing. The noun is the active agent in that action. And so that's why we call it an active participle, because the noun it's related to is performing that action. Later on, we'll learn about passive participles and in particular, Qal passive participles. And they're called passive because the participle is describing actions that are being done to the noun that the participle is related to. And so in that case, the noun is not the agent of the action. It's not the one performing the action. The noun is the one that the action is being done to. And that's just like if you're familiar with voice, you've got active voice, passive voice. That's the idea. In the active voice, the verb is being done by the subject. So the subject is performing the action. And in the passive voice, the action is being done to the subject. They are receiving the action. They are what we call the patient in that sentence. So the agent is the one that performs the action. The patient is the one that receives the action. And that's a little bit different than subject and object, which is a linguistics discussion or a grammar discussion we can get into later if you have questions. But the bottom line here, you need to understand that participles have verbal qualities and they also have adjective qualities. And I want you to be aware of all of those because so much of what we learned about adjectives just applies directly to participles, okay? So if we were to take an active participle, like we talked about the phrase, the singing women, singing is active there. If we ran into a passive participle, which we'll do later, if that participle were passive, it wouldn't be the singing women. And since you can't sing women, we would need a different noun. We would need something that you can sing. So what is something you can sing? Well, you can sing a song. So let's go with song. So instead of the singing people, a passive participle would be something like the sung song, or the song being sung would be another way to translate that. All right. So again, participles, verbal qualities, adjectival qualities, and what we mean by active is that the participle is describing the action that its noun is performing. Okay. Usually a participle will function as a noun itself. I shouldn't say usually, but often it will function as a noun itself. That's again that substantival idea. But oftentimes it will function attributively with a noun, and so in that case, it's the noun that it's attributing. It's the noun that it is modifying that would be the actor for an active participle. Hopefully that makes sense. Let me know if you have questions about that. Beyond that, let's narrow in a little bit on these verbal qualities. So just like the perfect conjugation, the imperfect conjugation, the infinitives, the participle is going to follow certain patterns. The form of the participle will follow certain patterns, and it's going to contain certain clues that let us know that it's a participle. So my professor, my Hebrew professor, when I took Hebrew, he used to call the participle the PORticipEYL, and that would remind us that the participle, the form, the first root letter has an O class vowel, usually that's the holum, and the second root letter had an E class vowel, and that's usually a serre, unless that serre has to reduce because of suffixes. And so this OA combination, PORticipEYL, that was just his memory aid of remembering or helping us remember what the forms of the participle were, the Qal Active Participle. And so basically, if you wanted to build a Qal Active Participle, if you wanted to look up a recipe for how to make a Qal Active Participle, you take the verbal root. Step one, take the verbal root, kof, tet, lamed here. Add a holum to R1 and a serre to R2. And that's going to give you the masculine singular form. Now, for the plural form, that's when we get back into the adjectives idea, because you're going to use the exact same suffixes that you used for adjectives and noun. Masculine plural, hirik, yod, mem. Of course, since we're adding a syllable to the end of the word, this serre, this has to reduce to a shabbat to make room for that syllable. So instead of kotel, we get ko-telim. The feminine, usually what would happen with an adjective or a noun is we would add kametz he to the end. And so you would get ko-telah. Actually, the participles, that is one form that a participle can take, that kametz he suffix, but often participles will take a different form for the feminine singular, and the form that they will take will actually look like a segolate noun with an extra letter at the front, okay? And so the final two letters of the root become this segolate part, so you get the segol-segol-tav pattern. So we've seen segol-segol-tav as a pattern for infinitives in the one yod vav. So one yod vav verbs, when they're in the infinitive construct, they have the segel segel tav pattern. You'll also see that segel segel tav pattern in the Qal active participle when it's feminine singular. And this form is actually, it's more common than this form right here. So just be aware of that. But other than that, your plural forms, those are all the same as this is holam vav tav for the feminine plural, ko to lot. So it's going to be pretty easy to recognize. When you have a participle, it's really going to look a lot like a noun or an adjective. And once you take off the endings, you'll get to that verbal root. And then you'll just ask yourself, is this a root that I've learned as a verb? And that will help you get to the participle idea. So that's really kind of the bulk of the information that you need to know about the form of the participle. Again, it's one little chart here, 4 different forms: masculine plural, masculine singular, feminine plural, feminine singular. Pretty straightforward. These participles can take suffixes, just like the infinitives could take suffixes. So be aware of that. You may see like a hierik yod at the end of a participle, or a holam vav or something like that. And in that case, the suffix usually is describing the object of the participle's action. With infinitives, we talked about how the suffix could describe either the object of the action of the infinitive or the subject of the action of the infinitive. It's ambiguous. Usually with participles, it's describing the object. All right, this section here, this box, this is good information, but it might confuse you quite a bit here, because this gets into a lot of morphology and historical development of the language that it's not really going to help you recognize forms. So you definitely, for the sake of quizzes and stuff, you don't need to worry about this information. If you're reading through it and it's confusing to you, just let it pass. You can come back to it later if you want to learn more about Hebrew. But I honestly would I think he includes this for the sake of, being more complete. Because there is information here that might be helpful as you go further in Hebrew, but for now, this might just come off as a little bit confusing for you, so you don't need to worry about that. Let's talk a little bit about what weak verbs look like in the Qal active participle. And really, there's only 3 that you need to worry about. They're primarily weak verbs because they're third gutturals. Now, the third aleph and the third hey are a little bit different in the way that they're weak, but if it's a third guttural, that's what you need to watch out for. You don't really have any weaknesses like the one yod or the one noon, because you don't have prefixes, so you don't really need to worry about it. It's really only the third gutturals that are going to, give you any sort of irregularity. And the general third gutturals aren't really that bad. It's just the sneaky patak that kind of pops up in here, where we would expect just a holam sere pattern. Again, the ayin here, it really likes the A class, so it's going to put a patak in there. No big deal. You're still going to see the OE vowel pattern. Feminine singular might be a little bit different, because instead of segel segel tav, it's patak patak tav, because again, this both the ayin and the chet have a strong preference for A-class vowels. But you saw the segel segel tav pattern possibly shift to patak patak tav in the infinitives already. So again, not really surprising there. The masculine plural form, there's really no irregularity here. It looks exactly the same. Same for the feminine plural. So it's really just these 2 forms that might be a little bit different. When we get to the third aleph, the reason why we get an issue here is because, again, that third aleph, it can't actually close a syllable. So anytime that the third root letter is supposed to close a syllable, you're going to get vowel changes if it's an aleph. And so that's why here, instead of segel segel tav really only works when you've got a short open syllable and then a short accented syllable. But when this right here, this 8, this is all one syllable. So instead of segel segel tav, it's just going to be sere aleph tav. So again, that's not going to give you the red flag waving in the air saying, hey, I'm a feminine singular participle, that the segel segel tav or the patak patak tav may give you. So, but if you just remember, if you're just aware that aleph causes problems and it causes problems for vowels, then that shouldn't be too big of a deal for you. All right, and then the third hays, again, anytime you add a vocalic suffix, that is a suffix that begins with a vowel, third hays are going to drop out. Now, masculine singular doesn't add any suffix, but just like in the imperfect, when you've got a third hay participle, specifically Qal active participle, you're going to get segel hay instead of comets hay. Okay, so just be aware of that. Feminine singular participle is another one that it shouldn't be too tricky, because you've still got this O class vowel, you've got the comets hay ending, but it just sort of feels like something's missing. Like it's a feminine singular participle, but there's only 3 letters. Over here there's 4. Well, again, that's because that third hay drops out. Now, in some cases, like the Qal perfect 3FS, if you were to drop that comets hey ending and just put another comets hey ending on it, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between a Qal Perfect 3MS and a Qal Perfect 3FS. That's why in the Qal Perfect 3FS, the final hey hardens into a tav and then takes the comets hey suffix. But here you can tell a difference because in the masculine singular of the participle, you get the segel hey. In the feminine singular, you get the comets hey. And I mentioned this before, segel hey is going to end up becoming as reliable, it may not be as frequent, but it will become as reliable of an indication of gender as comets hey is. Segel hey is almost always masculine singular, okay? And comets hey is almost always feminine singular. Then when we look at these plural forms here, again, it just looks like something's missing. It looks like there's not enough letters here. Well, that's because, again, whenever you add a vocalic suffix to a third hey verb, the hey is going to disappear, and that's exactly what's happened. So these weak verbs are not overwhelming. They're not too confusing. You know, they are a little bit different, but they shouldn't be too hard to get your head wrapped around. So hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that's helpful for you. That's kind of looking at the verbal sort of qualities. To talk a little bit more about the adjectival characteristics, I just want to stress the similarity in function. Just like the adjectives can function attributively, predicatively, or substantively, participles are exactly the same. And the translations for attributive, the translations for predicative, and the translations for substantive that you used for adjectives, you're going to use the same process for participles. And so, you know, if we take that, the singing women as the attributive idea, again, the singing women would be attributive. The women are singing is how you would translate a predicative participle. And if it's a substantival participle, you would just translate that as the singing ones, or you could just say the singers. That would be a substantival idea, and there you're basically just translating it as a noun. All right, so those are the functions. Let me also mention one other thing about participles. We've talked about the verbal characteristics and the adjective characteristics. There's also a noun characteristic that you need to keep in mind, and that's because participles, just like adjectives, can function substantively, which a substantive is really just another word for describing the function of a noun, okay? So just like adjectives can function as nouns, so can participles. Well, if they can function as nouns, then they can also function in the construct state. They can form construct chains with other nouns or with other substantives. So you need to be aware that the same sort of vowel changes, you know, that shortening of vowels, and those, you know, the sere yod suffix, the ptaktav suffix on feminine singular constructs, those apply to participles as well. So if you see some spelling irregularities that kind of remind you of the construct, that is something that does hold in the participles. They can be in construct. Usually a participle is in the absolute state. It just looks normal. But it can be in construct with another substantive, whether that's a noun or a substantival participle or whatever. So be aware of that. Don't let that throw you off. Let's look through here some of the things that Futato points out that you should just be aware of. Participles really do not indicate what we call tense, or the time at which the action takes place relative to the speaking or the description of that. So, you know, in English we could say I ran, and that would be past tense. The running occurred prior to me talking about it. I am running, or I run, is present tense. That means that the action is seen as taking place sort of contemporaneously with my talking about it. And then of course I will run, future. That means that the running will take place in the future relative to when I'm talking about it. That's tense. The participle has no tense, so it could be interpreted as past, present, or future. There's nothing about the participle itself that says this is past, present, or future. You need to determine the timing of the action of the participle from the context. And sometimes you'll have enough information to make a determination, sometimes you won't. And there are, you know, it could either be was writing or is writing. Usually when we're talking about the tense, quote unquote, of the participle, we're talking about it in its predicative function. That's when you would get this idea of tense anyways. This isn't usually going to apply to the attributive or the substantival form of the participle, but when it's a predicative participle and you need to supply a to be verb there, you have to think, should this be is writing, is sitting, is walking, or should this be was writing, was sitting, was walking? And I'll just tell you, on the quizzes, you're usually probably not going to have enough information on the quiz to say, oh, this is definitely present or definitely past. And usually, again, I haven't looked at the quiz, I don't know if this is the case, but my guess is with just one sentence, it's probably okay whether you say was walking, is walking. That's probably fine either way. The point here is that the participle doesn't communicate when the action takes place. It communicates how the action takes place. And the way that we describe that is continuing action or ongoing action or unfolding action. It's usually thought of as action that is in progress or progressive action. And so is writing, is sitting, was sitting. Those, when we speak that way, we're portraying that action as ongoing. That's what the participle does. It gives this sort of like progressive unfolding idea. That's sometimes called aspect, but aspect is another tricky thing that has a lot of different definitions. So just be aware of that. This participle is focusing on unfolding action. You don't want to translate a participle as wrote or write or sit or sat or walk or walked unless there's good evidence in the context where that translation makes sense. You usually want to translate an attributive or a substantival, well, maybe not substantival, an attributive or a predicative participle. You usually want to have a word with that ing ending on it. Another thing to be aware of is that when you have this particle hene plus a participle, that's something that is referred to, I think the imminent future. So that idea is this is something that's about to happen. Is that future, is that present? It's kind of a little bit of both. So here it would say, if you wanted to translate this literally, hene doesn't mean behold, but it gets translated that way a lot. Hene is a particle of attention. And what it means is when you see that, you can kind of think of it as like an exclamation point, sort of. It's like, it's trying to get your, it'd be kind of like saying, hey, like it's an attention getter, that sort of a thing. And then it says, ani shofet, hey, I judging. That doesn't sound good in English. Hey, I judging. What it means is, hey, I am about to, I'm starting to judge, or it's about to happen, is that sort of idea. So, hene ani holech, this would be, I'm about to walk, or I'm about to go. All right, so that's something to keep in mind. We talked about the three functions, attributive, predicative, and substantival, and then the states, the construct or the absolute state. So hopefully that makes sense. We talked about the suffixes as well. If you have questions about these, let me know. I hope that we'll have some time to do a little bit of practice and translation of the participles in the video conference, but if we don't get to it and you have any questions, always feel free to reach out with them. That's it as far as the lesson for this week goes. The final thing that I want to bring up is just start the process of securing a proctor for your midterm. You do need another individual to proctor your midterm and your final, and that is in Unit 8. So that's coming up. So the proctor will need to be someone who can send me, it's basically just an email saying two things. I was present for the entirety of the exam, and the student completed this quiz in one sitting without the help of any resources, aids, notes, textbooks. If I don't get this report, if I don't get this email from your proctor, I have to put a 50% penalty on your exam. So please start getting someone in line now that can be there with you for the entire duration of your quiz, of your midterm. I think that's timed for 2 hours. Most students won't take 2 hours, so but I don't want to say, hey, you can get it done in 30 minutes and then your proctor's there for 2 hours. So just let them understand that, hey, this is what I need. I need someone who can be with me for as much as 2 hours. And then they will email me this proctor. So if I get that, great. If I don't get that, I might send one email and say, hey, I haven't gotten your proctor report yet. And if I still don't have it after that, I'm going to apply the penalty. Now, as long as you get it to me before I submit grades, I mean, that's fine. I will undo the penalty. But if I don't get a proctor report from you, there's a significant penalty. So what I would recommend is when that proctor sends that report to me, have them CC your email address in there as well so that you get a copy, so that you know whether or not it came to me. Again, I will go through. If I don't get one from you, I will let you know I didn't get one. And then you can follow up with your proctor. But it's a good idea to just ask them to copy you on it so that you know that it went through. All right, that's going to be it. Hope you guys are having a great week. We'll see you in the video conference.